Hello, my name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today with me is Nicholas Myers. Hi, Nick.
Hello, Jacek.
Nicholas Myers, as you know, cooperates with Strategy and Future. This time around, he speaks from Rhode Island U.S. Naval War College. Nick, we are recording this conversation on the 23rd of September, 2022. Yesterday, or 2 days ago, actually, President Putin announced the partial mobilization of the Russian forces. What does that mean? What is your take on this fact, and how does it unfold? How it is being processed? What is your initial assessment?
So I'll start by saying that these are my personal views. They are not necessarily those of the United States government, the U.S. Naval War College, or the Department of the Navy. No, I'm now speaking from my office at the Naval War College. So the basic thing that I think is most important to see here is that clearly Putin feels under pressure to act much more quickly than he was probably disposed to do so until about a week ago. The fact that this partial mobilization is announced very soon after the Ukrainians have successfully recaptured a variety of towns east of Kharkiv and have cut off the attempt to encircle the Donbass through Izium and from the north in general, is unusual for Putin to unusual in how quickly Putin responded. What this means most likely is that either one of two things is happening, or possibly both. One, the Russian net assessment that the thing is now to wait until Europe has some chance to destabilize winter politics with less gas, is presumed no longer to be as viable an option as it was before, since the line may not be as secure in Ukraine as was previously perceived. Or two, there is increasing internal and external political pressure that Putin must respond to this problem relatively fast. I don't know if it is either one of those things. It's curious that it happened so soon after the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, but my interpretation of the meeting is much like everybody else. The leaders of China and India were trying to force Putin to end the war, as opposed to escalating it even more dramatically with a mobilization, which is going to take time to execute. So it would seem that Putin is still trying to act independently, but feels himself very much under pressure. Now, how this can be executed, this partial mobilization, is really one of two ways. They can either try to take this very slowly and actually train all this manpower that's now going to be available to them, and then try to methodically send them in over the course of the next several months in order first to shore up the line and ultimately to start using superior resources to overrun the Ukrainians the traditional Soviet and Tsarist way. Or they can just try to train them as rapidly as possible, dump them into the fight in the hopes that this might somehow overturn recent conditions. The first one, I think, would actually be a relatively smart strategy, though obviously the Russians wouldn't be able to fully execute it for probably a year, maybe possibly even more. Second one, I think, is a very high stakes gamble that, if it fails, will leave Russia in a very catastrophic position.
Mm-hmm. Meaning even collapse of the state, yeah?
It's on the table. At this point, I would say I would no longer be surprised if we got the news one morning that Putin's been replaced by someone. I don't expect it to happen, but I would no longer be surprised if that was announced.
And based on what Svechin used to write in old times about mobilization and Shaposhnikov, how fragile this moment is, what is your assessment? Why did they decide for the partial, gradual mobilization? Why is it the case? How do you read it?
I think the obvious answer is the correct one here, that Putin is not very competent at specific military matters, that he is still looking at what is going to be the best way to not go to extremes and to try to moderate whatever pressure is going to be created by this war on the Russian economy at home. I do think it would have made more sense to go to just saying that the West has turned Ukraine into a war and that it's not our fault that they have decided to do this, and just gone for the extreme and start actually getting the entire country mobilized. But we know that one of Putin's longstanding weaknesses is that he wants to be in the middle of these debates. That's traditionally how he has prevailed over his domestic political opponents. But in this particular circumstance, I think that's it's not much more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the capacity? I think we agree that Russia inherited the mobilization system of the Soviet Union, but in the 90s, due to the lack of funds, it sort of disintegrated. And then with the Serdyukov and Shoigu reforms, it disintegrated even further. So even if you have the conscripts, which is in doubt anyway, given the shrinking numbers of the citizens, citizens of Russian Federation, but also, given the lack of facilities, lack of training depots, lack of, warehouses, catastrophic state of the equipment, as was, displayed during the war in Ukraine over the last 7 months. Well, how do you think? How will they organize filling in the ranks? Whether they will be sending the recruits directly to the existing units, or there will be some units, separate units being created somewhere in the strategic depth. What do you think? And what would be the difference and the political consequences for either of those scenarios?
So the first point of detail is just for completion. The conscription system, as we know it today, dates back to the Milyutin reforms, the 1860s, so even further back to the Soviets. And you are absolutely correct to point out the whole point of the Serdyukov reforms that Shoigu mostly continued, though did put a variety of twists into it, in some cases weakening, in other cases strengthening them, is to move beyond this conscription system. The key weakness that has emerged through the attrition of units without doing a mobilization sooner than now is that a lot of the trainers, the Russian NCOs and junior officers that do the integration of new conscript batches in the Russian armed forces have had to be sent to the front and are now attrited, let's call it, either still engaged at the front or a variety of them are dead. I wouldn't say all, but a large number of them are dead. Without this core, the tradition of sending conscripts to the individual unit in order to learn is going to be extremely difficult. So considering how we have seen the standing up of a variety of new units already this year, I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes the standard now, is that they're going to begin to call what is left of those people, of those NCOs, into a variety of new units in order to stand those and sort of keep the contractors in separate brigades. That is speculation on my part. They could attempt to send them all to the forward deployed units fairly soon, but I think that would be an even bigger catastrophic mistake, considering how difficult it is for them to hold all of the proper training units in order during normal times when they're attempting to simultaneously do deployments. I've seen a variety of these brigades being sent on temporary peacekeeping missions where it's resulted in pretty serious shortfalls in subsequent training capabilities for maybe a 2-year period afterward. That we're going to start seeing this happening in the middle of what is a large-scale war in which a lot of units are pretty much combat ineffective at this point seems quite difficult to imagine. But the Russians have done some pretty strange and irrational, let's say strange and wrong moves so far this year. So it wouldn't be the first time that they would do something also unusual.
But in either of those two scenarios, it is potentially catastrophic for Russia. Scenario number one, that the recruits are being sent directly to the units, which means that they can be treated even faster than the old units, the old staffing, old soldiers, and they will be brought back in bags to the families from which they were just conscripted, creating exactly this social effect that Putin has been trying to avoid for the 7 months, right? and that might destabilize Russia, just like it did in the First World War. Or in the second scenario, if they are forming new units, they would need to have the equipment. And apparently, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Russia has displayed that they have shortages of the equipment in proper, standard and proper technical standing to equip those new units. So maybe they will reach out to China to provide China with the Chinese version of the land lease and equipment for Russia, and that might trigger, let's say it openly, Third World War if China decides to help that way. What do you think about those, assessments?
So if the rumors we're seeing on social media are correct, that these people being mobilized are only going to be given 15 days of training before they go into the special military operation, then yes, it's going to be a major disaster. And there's going to be a lot more families afflicted by this in a very short period of time. If they are going for the second option, I believe these do still have a substantial quantity of aged equipment, vintage equipment from the late Soviet Union. Much of it was probably not functional, but I wouldn't say all of it is. Maybe 30%, if 30% of their stocks are still functional, that's still a decent amount of material to go out with, though obviously ammunition is much depleted and it's going to be against superior equipment that the Ukrainians possess. If you start going to China in order to get that material, I suspect the Chinese have sufficient stockpiles for them to use, but I don't think the Chinese perceive themselves as ready to do the standoff in a Third World War yet. So
because you agree that this might be a direct path to the Third World War, right?
If the Chinese agree to do this, then yes, I think World War III's timeline is about 6 months or less away. I don't think the Chinese will do that for a variety of reasons, but I agree with you completely that if the Chinese did do that, then it's only a matter of time before the whole world is at war.
And here comes the thing that is very worrying for me. When I observe it from Eurasia, there are some works in the American Congress on, imposing the preventive sanctions on China in order to prevent China from invading Taiwan. Sanctions on their most modern branches of economy, semiconductors and stuff. There is a debate in the American Congress. Don't you think that actions like that might sort of instigate Xi Jinping and his comrades into thinking that the United States is after them anyway, and they have no other options just to keep Russians afloat? What do you think about that thing?
I do think that logic is coming. I'm not sure that we're still within 12 months of that, but and in fact, I do think that all of the security dilemmas that have precipitated over the past couple of weeks, especially since it became clear that the Kharkiv offensive was going to be a smashing success, have actually made my predictions for next year much less dire than they were, specifically because we are now seeing pretty open signals from Chinese propaganda organs that the Russians need to de-escalate this, which is different. Previously, they had been calling on all sides to de-escalate this, but now it seems that they are being a bit more pointed about needing to be at the forefront of that process. Now, I think the logic that you're referring to is nevertheless correct in the medium to long term, where we are all kind of sitting on the edge of our seat, I suppose, in the next month or two, is that this is coming all at the worst possible moment for Xi Jinping, since he's about 2 months away from supposedly cementing his position as head of the Chinese Communist Party for as long as he wishes. If he starts to commit to those sorts of things now, I think the voices at this moment that would be against Xi Jinping, which are stronger than they are typically portrayed, but not at the point that they could overthrow him informally. I suspect much more that they have a decent chance of organizing at the upcoming plenary in a more formal manner in terms of vote than anything else. I'm not nearly as much a China expert, but if they are going to make a stand against Xi, it's going to be through the form of just obstructing the process of this plenary as opposed to trying to overthrow him on some weekend, I would suspect. Which, considering that might be a possibility, I don't think Xi is going to commit to something that directly conducive to an imminent conflict. In no small part because there is recognition increasingly within the Chinese Communist Party that the public is not on board with them the same way that the Russians deluded themselves to believe that they had politically reformed the Russian young people to believe that Ukraine actually was part of Russia. So this whole political work dimension to things is now recognized, at least in China, as being not nearly sufficiently complete. So they are currently caught in a difficult position. Do they strike now, or rather, do they prepare to strike now while the economics are still sufficiently good that they can do this relatively smoothly, or do they have to wait a while? I still think that their net assessment is that the Chinese capabilities are weak. Sorry, that the Chinese net assessment is that U.S. capabilities are still weakening in the short term, whilst the U.S. Navy is still adjusting to doing its new shipbuilding program as all the Reagan-era ships are still being decommissioned. So the Chinese still have time to debate this, which is another reason why I suspect they are going to continue to be patient for another couple of years. By the late 2020s, I think that interval will be over.
Mm. Yeah, in the context of the Russian mobilization and in the view of the Ukrainian victory at Izium and Kupiansk, do you agree with the opinion that once the Russians started flowing new troops into the front line, the Western support for Ukraine will consolidate even further to balance the inflows of the new soldiers, and the new shipments of even more modern and more capable weaponry will be provided to the Ukrainians so that they could really treat the Russian forces? Do you agree with such opinion?
I do, if it happens quickly. While the Western imagination is thinking about it squarely in the center of their minds, if the Russians start moving things in fast, then yes, I do think that there is a serious possibility that there would be escalation on the Western side as well. Which again is why I am puzzled why Putin is moving so quickly now, when typically he spends a lot of time, wastes a lot of time typically when he's making unpopular decisions. Between the instigating event and him finally declaring what the resolution of that event is going to be. The easiest way, if you are in a difficult position, but you have something easy to do that involves causing harm to the other side, I think typically the opponent is going to take that easy thing that just causes harm, even if it doesn't have an appreciable short-term strategic effect. So if we end up in a situation where in a couple of weeks, the Russians are deploying a whole bunch of forces into Ukraine at the same time that energy prices in Europe continue to spike, I think the appropriate thing that Western governments are going to do to shore up their own popularity is show that they are fighting back in a very demonstrable way.
Mm.
Now, I remain concerned that if the Russians figure out all the problems with mobilization in their country, which are enormous, and that they actually spend the time to train these forces appropriately, then in perhaps 18 months or so, the Europeans could find themselves completely devoid of any ammunition left, having given it all to the Ukrainians, and the Russians now finally on the march forward, having absorbed everything that the Westerners have dumped into Ukraine. So I don't think the Russians have necessarily lost the war, but all signs show that they are not taking the correct actions to getting to that potential victory.
So in that respect, my last question is, what the situation will look like in, let's say, March 2023?
Well, there's a couple of possibilities I can imagine. The first one is that the Russians do spend a considerable amount of time training these forces. We could see either the slow introduction of these newly mobilized forces into the Ukrainian front line, probably starting about that time in order to allow for an offensive next year, or perhaps a month earlier in order to try to do it on the anniversary of the start of the special military operation. In which case, the serious question is how much more progress do the Ukrainians make before that happens? And there, I think that there's some serious possibilities the Ukrainians will do some further rollback in other less defended sections of the front, like around Zaporizhia Oblast or elsewhere in the south. The second option I can imagine easily is what if the Russians decide to just start dumping soldiers at the front after as little training as possible in order to shore up these positions, but don't go on any offensive actions for a while, which would probably result in a more stable front line between Russia and Ukraine, but even heavier casualties flowing back into the Russian heartland, which would really start to cause additional political distress. The third option is they start dumping these guys in there and they order more offensives in order to try to bring the war to a close straight away, in which case, really, it either hinges on do the Russians get sufficient shock value from doing this? I think the odds of this are not 0%, but they are not much better than 1 in 5, in my opinion. So if they did that, most likely they would recover some ground, but be insufficient to actually overwhelm Kiev itself, which means that we'd be in an extremely precarious position indeed. Now, in all of those, I would say the odds of Putin being overthrown at any particular point are about 50-50, though if he goes for that last option, probably more closer to 2 and 3. The difficulty with all of this is that the state in Russia itself is pretty immune to coups. What would be necessary is for some sort of cabal with the resources to establish an alternative state to align themselves with sufficient interests in charge of different cabinet departments in order to accomplish this. I don't see an easy path to doing this, but I do see a lot of paths that could involve some serious questions about the dissolution of the Russian government's unity.
Okay. Fair enough, Nick. We will see what happens. Thank you very much. Our guest today was Nicholas Myers. And you stay with us for more episodes to come. Thank you, Nick.
A lot of uncertainties, but plenty more excitement.
Exactly.